Two games on. 15 love.
Hi, my name is Steve Corrie, and for the last 17 years I've been fortunate to be a physical education teacher in schools right across Australia. In this program we're going to have a look at how we can utilise the subject of physical education to create thinking players.
What's particular about those who are the best of the best with those flexible and adaptive responses, which sometimes make them unpredictable but definitely gives them the competitive edge, is that they've practiced in a different way to other people. They've practiced with a level of movement and tactical creativity that other people haven't. And they've developed a way of thinking which is unlike people who have only been coached and taught to think a prescribed way.
Merge the technique and the tactic together is a really important component. Tennis has traditionally been taught with a very direct style. Lines, technical mastery and producing stylised techniques before any tactical application, and then the game has always been delivered last. But I think a more contemporary version of that now is tennis coaching. Tennis coaches are using a far more contemporary version, which is the game sense approach.
That what you're wanting through a game sense or a game-based approach is players that can solve the problems that the game set for themselves.
I find that I use very much a tactical approach rather than a technical approach.
You've got to come to it with a different headset, so you're not necessarily the fount of all knowledge, and so I've been stunned on occasions by what kids already know.
I talk to lots of athletes, and the training sessions they enjoy the most are when they play a game. The old approach, or what you might say the more common physical education method, which Tinning describes as demonstrate, explain, practice. So the teacher or the coach will demonstrate a movement, explain the movement cues, explain how the practice is going to occur, and then students go out and practice. Now, it's based on an assumption of replication. The closer they can, the athletes or the students can replicate the movement that's being demonstrated, the more successful they are. So you can go to a textbook, you can get the cues, you can get an idealised movement performance that, regardless of your individual biology, physiology, stage of development, you've got to be able to execute a movement that looks exactly like that. Regardless of the conditions of the game, regardless of the defensive pressure of the opponents, the amount of opponents around you, it's got to look like that or you're not successful. So therefore you get rigidity of techniques, and you get a narrative of, well, it's got to look like that or you're not successful. Whereas the reality of the game is that techniques need to be flexible and adaptive and responsive to the moment.
So I want to take you on a journey. I want to show you 4 different pedagogical approaches used in the subject of physical education. First, we're going to have a look at a traditional approach. Then we're going to move through to the 6-step model of teaching games for understanding. Thirdly, we look at a parallel approach, and finally we look in depth at a game sense approach in teaching physical education.
Your traditional approaches, from my perspective, are this view of, to an extent, a skills and drills approach.
I think in the past there may have been an overemphasis on that element of skill play without actually having an understanding of the whole thing. And so we would have seen perhaps lessons set up where there was just technical practice in isolation, and then at the end they play in a game, which really doesn't make sense at all. However, if your thinking is limited, then that's possibly what you think is the appropriate thing to do.
Well, a traditional approach might be skills and drills, so it could be a case of working with a partner, one ball between each pair, and they just passing the ball back and forth. I find that traditionally that it hasn't worked because those players who are already skillful at that particular sport, they're not able to improve much in that time. The students who are not particularly skilled at that sport, you just can't teach them in the limited PE opportunity that you've got.
While not all traditional teaching in physical education can be regarded as poor practice, it may be argued that not providing students with authentic opportunities to develop their tactical understanding has limited the impact of the learning in the past. Fortunately, game-based pedagogies provide a wonderful opportunity to not only learn the game, but also develop thinking abilities that will serve students throughout their lifetime. One such game-based pedagogy is that of teaching games for understanding. Now, this was a pedagogy developed by Bunker and Thorpe back in the 1980s. It was because they recognised that skill development limited people to some extent in transitioning those skills into gameplay.
Rod Thorpe came out to Australia in the early 1990s to mid-1990s, worked with the Australian Sports Commission on a game-based model of coaching that could also be applied in a phys ed setting, more or less based on the ideas that coalesced in the Teaching Games for Understanding model that Bunker, Thorpe and Armand had published about 10 years before that. And that was in response to the Sports Commission saying that the way to get kids engaged, sustain that engagement and maintain that engagement for the long term in sport was to make it more about playing the game than learning to do specific movements or stylised movements, which we might call technique. So shifting the pedagogical conversation from technique first to game first.
Start with a small-sided game in a parallel approach to expose people to the parameters of how things are played. But then we might move out of that game to focus on a particular technique, and it's about then technical development. So if we were to take the push pass or the pass as an example in soccer, and then the next small-sided game that were to follow that would emphasise, almost in a constraints-led theory approach, would emphasise how that kick is utilised or how that pass is utilised within the game. So then we would hopefully see an improvement in the way that game is played because of the time spent and the improvement on that particular technique. And once we start to see that happening, there's an opportunity to ask questions about the use of that kick, where we might need something else, to then move back out of the game, further develop that technique or develop a new technique, and then move back into a game. So in its simplest essence, parallel approach is moving from game to technical practice, back into game, to technical practice, and back into game.
So game sense is actually defined, and if you look at the definition, so it's the ability to use an understanding of the rules, of tactics, of strategy and of oneself to overcome the problems presented in the game.
Lots of people will say they're playing games and so they're doing a game sense approach. But games have been part of physical education teachers and sports coaches' pedagogical toolkit for forever. So playing games of itself is not a game sense approach. Doing a scratch match at the start of training and the end of training is not a game sense approach. The idea of a game sense approach is that the game or the game form, the modified version of the game you're playing, has an educational intent. You know why you're playing this game. You as the coach or the teacher want them to learn something from this game, or you're using the game deliberately to set the intention of the lesson or the coaching session that you're doing. So it's got a tactical or technical focus, and the opening game sets that sharply to the player's attention, and then you can start to explore it as you move through the training session.
Having taught for 10 years in a middle school, whenever you introduce a new unit into to the students, what's the first thing they say? Can we play a game? And I think in essence, to me, that's probably the most important or the biggest benefit of the game sense approach is that you get into the games straight away. So it's game centered and it's player centered.
The first time I used a game sense approach years and years ago, the biggest change I saw in the kids was they started to smile straight up, because I suppose skill and drill is typically a 5-week program, and if we're good at the end, we'll play a game.
It works with young people's and adults' motivations to play. When I was a footballer, the training sessions where we had scratch matches were the training sessions I enjoyed the most.
That what you're wanting through a game sense or a game-based approach is players that can solve the problems that the game's set for themselves. So rather than looking to the coach at the side of the court or off the field or waiting for instructions before they make changes to their game plan or whatever else they're doing, I've got players that I can work with who think for themselves, can make decisions about technique, about tactics, and also are decent human beings.
So how do you actually make the move in going from being a person who teaches in a traditional manner to being someone who teaches in a more contemporary game sense approach? Let's have a listen to what leading practitioner of a game sense pedagogy, Associate Professor Shane Pill, has to say about exactly how he made that move.
His phys ed classes would always start with a game. My phys ed classes would be more typically closed to open drill progressions. My classes, we were in a good school, so it was easy to get good results from the kids, but my classes got to a high standard of performance. Brian's classes got to a high standard of performance. But it was my observation that there was greater joy, greater engagement from the kids when the game started. Brian never had to deal with the question, when are we going to play a game? Because every class started with a game. The question became, what game are we playing today, not are we playing a game?
By starting with a game, you're getting greater engagement, and the kids can see the relevance through the games and the way you've constructed the games to what they're playing, either in the yard, at recess and lunchtime, or maybe even on the weekend.
So how do we actually ensure that skills are still developed while allowing students to be involved in authentic gameplay? One of the methods used is that of information movement coupling.
Information movement coupling essentially means that you need to be able to read the environment, select the appropriate information to coordinate your movement response. The coordination of your movement response goes into what you know to do in this particular situation. So if you like, you've got a menu that you can select from, and what's the most appropriate response. Now, with elite level athletes, they're doing that so quickly that we call it autonomous. But really, their brain is so sharply tuned to the information in the environment because they've seen it before, they've done it before, they know what to do, that they can move into a response faster than somebody who hasn't practiced in that environment to develop an understanding of this is the pattern and this is the optimal solution to that pattern. I've never seen this moment in the game before because every moment in a game is unique, but that moment creates a pattern which creates recognition, which leads me to make a decision. And if I can make that decision faster than other people, I've got a competitive advantage. So information movement coupling is where coupling the information in the environment to a response in order to bring about an action.
It's worth noting here that for people who don't fully understand the idea behind information movement coupling, where they only develop skills, they're really shortchanging their athlete or the student that they're working with. Consider this. If a goal shooter in netball wants to develop their ability to shoot, they actually need to complete approximately 500,000 repetitions to go from being a beginner to being elite. The question is, can genuine skill development be achieved within the scope of a standard school physical education program? Developing tactical understandings in a sport such as netball might include learning how to provide support for a teammate or utilising the width of the court and so on. Fortunately, these aspects of the game can be learned very quickly, and when teamed with developing technique, a more complete learning experience is achieved because the teacher has provided an opportunity for learning to take place in a context that more fully represents the game itself.
Context matters. Right, if you want someone to play better within a game, they need to be immersed in a game, all right, and as early as possible, and whether that be a simplified version of the game or something that's closer to the actual context, then the better they're going to be able to learn it.
One of the toughest situations for any teacher of any subject to deal with is when they're working with reluctant learners. And in the area of physical education, we're very, very fortunate that a game sense pedagogy is regarded by many, many students as being extremely engaging.
So if you like, that affective domain is more strongly engaged through a game sense approach, because as I mentioned earlier, it shifts the question from are we going to play a game to what game are we playing today.
Making sure that we're doing things that are going to engage kids, get them involved and hooked in, and certainly the use of games in that is really a key foundation.
The game categories you're teaching, the sports you're teaching, I think you've got to know them better. You've got to know them in a deeper way. So if you like, your content knowledge isn't just skill and drill, which you can wrap your head around in most sports, but it's also the tactical awareness. It's also, you know, how kids get on with each other when they're working together. So you're going to have to bring a lot more game knowledge and a lot more of the interpersonal skill knowledge so that kids can operate at that level. And I think you've got to be a bit more flexible. So you've got to be able to differentiate more in your class than skill and drill is a one-size-fits-all model. And you start at one point where you say, well, I reckon most of the class will be here, and off we go and we progress. Whereas I think it's more, game sense is more an ecological model, you know, and it's more interactive between the teacher and the students. The amount of secondary teachers, so these are our phys ed specialists who say to me, I don't teach tennis. It's too hard to teach, because they're coming at it through a technique lens, and of course when they bump into a lot of coaches, tennis coaches, they are technical coaches. They've been drilled in that technical approach in their coaching courses going way back. So you get, with that approach, you also get very black and white answers. You get very right and wrong answers. You rarely get an answer of, well, it depends on what the situation is, you know, whether it's a technical problem or a tactical problem.
The shape of the learning environment that you set up will predict or will enable players to maybe think a little bit more about what's actually happening in that context, and they'll have to then use that decision making as they read the play and they react to it to be able to problem solve, to solve the problems that are set in that environment.
Through the game sense approach, I think there's more provision to be able to experiment with more implicit learning, where the coach may set up an activity and it might be quite open, and it's allowing the students to experiment with their movements and allow the activity or the environment to do a little bit of teaching, and thus that would be considered more implicit. Certainly doesn't diminish our ability to use explicit, but I think they would sit on a continuum, and the coach would obviously implement implicit to explicit learning depending on the students and the objectives of the activity.
If you want to accelerate the learning a little bit more, then the coach or the teacher can also be quite smart in the way that they focus the play. So they can actually shape that environment, add some additional things in there, add a focus to it in order to help promote and accelerate learning.
A large part of the game sense approach is this notion of game modification, which is obviously linked to the constraints-led approach. So within tennis, practical examples, Steve, might be that the ball is allowed to bounce twice or 3 times to permit more time for the player that's receiving the ball. Another modification might be making the target areas larger or smaller, might be lowering the net, or it might be eliminating the net completely. Equally, it might be eliminating the rackets, so players, instead of drop and hitting, are underarm throwing and catching. There could be other modifications. Instead of catching with your hands, that you're using a bucket, using their hat. I think that you're only limited by your imagination to the modifications that you can make, but still maintaining the central feature of the activity being projection and reception.
One of the greatest modification tools that you can use is the change it model, which gives you different clues and ideas about how you might change up a training session or a lesson.
Certainly, many years ago when I was being taught, that's what it was, isolated skill practice within just the physical domain. But we recognise that obviously tennis is not a closed skill. It requires development in the cognitive domain, so decision making, but also equally in the affective, fun and enjoyment. So I guess with parents watching now, our education to them is that yes, the technique and the physical repetition of skills is important, but it needs to be connected to some sort of tactical outcome, and thus we can have a player drop and hitting, and instead of the ball going to nowhere, just to the back of the fence, there can be a player either in receiving that or catching it, or even hitting it back, and that replicates the game a little bit, and it certainly feeds that development in the cognitive domain. So a lot of our education to parents is talking to them about tennis is not just about the physical skills, it's also about the decision making, which equates to the tactical application, and we've found that quite a successful way of explaining that. And as you know, within the game sense approach, being able to merge the technique and the tactic together is a really important component.
Utilising game modifications allows the central concepts of the sport to be maintained while providing entry points for all students. In the sport of tennis, this means modifying tasks around the theme of rallying, where projection and reception of the ball can be achieved in a myriad of fun and interesting ways, all of which assisting in the development of critical principles of play relevant to the game itself.
If we have some key biomechanical markers, so maybe an image of just some basic movements to make the shot more successful, and one of the examples was to get the body to the side and to catch. So that would be a very common aspect when we're all hitting forehands and backhands, is to get space. The playing area can be quite messy, and it can be perceived as messy, that there's lots of students being active, and I think traditionally as coaches we've been taught to control the environment all the time. So my piece of advice would be to practitioners is to allow that messiness to occur, and I think that we refer to it as the swamp of practice, or even the notion of this organised chaos, but it certainly leads to feeding the development of the physical and the cognitive domains.
The principles of play, I suppose, are the things that each of the 4 content areas of the games, like net and wall games, invasion games, striking and fielding games, and target games, they are the things that remain consistent. Doesn't matter what game you're playing. Those principles of play will be the same in each of those 4 categories in each of the sports. And I suppose the advantage there are a number of advantages. First of all, you start to deal with the sport more holistically. So you're actually starting, I think, from where the learner is, right? Which is, how do I play this game? What have I got to do? What problems do I have to solve? Whether they be technical or tactical, doesn't matter. And then when you get teaching this stuff, I think the exciting stuff that I'm starting to see with some teachers now in schools is that they're actually teaching for transfer of the understanding of these principles of play, maybe over a 10-week period. So instead of teaching one sport, teachers are now beginning to say, let's teach, say, invasion games for a term, and I'll teach 6 sports, and through those 6 sports, the kids will start to learn what the principles of play are and how they can transfer their understandings between sports.
Peter Dacos was a bit like Eddie Betts today. He could kick these miraculous goals left and right foot, and he was asked, where did this talent come from? Was it natural? How did it develop? And he said, well, my dad was a soccer player. He knew nothing about Australian football. He was a goalkeeper. So he'd set some goals up in the backyard. I'd have a football because I wanted to play football, and he'd be saying to me, get the ball past me. So I was experimenting with different drops on the ball, making the ball bounce in different ways, making the ball curve in different ways. So there was a lot of backyard practice that went into being able to do that in a game.
So the opportunity for physical educators right now is to reflect upon their current practice. What is it that you're currently doing? And can you perhaps look at taking new and innovative approaches that might just make education for your students, physical education for that matter, even more relevant for the people you teach day in, day out, and ultimately create thinking players?